Let's start our second Windows episode with a big one. The second part in the Dark Forces series in the Star Wars franchise, Jedi Knight. As usual, this footage is unemulated using the actual original CD-ROM version of the game, but you can buy it on Steam and GOG.com for your entertainment from less difficult points of approach. Now that the most recent mess of Star Wars movies has passed, it's nostalgic to get back to a time when the most recent Star Wars movie was Return of the Jedi, and the most we could even expect as new content in the saga was in the form of computer and video games. There had been a couple of space shooter/simulation games, such as X-Wing vs TIE Fighter, which gave us the opportunity to get properly acquainted with the space combat vehicles in the Star Wars world, but Dark Forces, released in 1995, was the first Star Wars-themed first-person shooter in the style of Doom that put you in the shoes of a mercenary called Kyle Katarn, employed by the Rebel Alliance. My personal introduction to modern Star Wars games came through Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight, which came out in 1999, so Windows 95 or 98 was necessary for the game to run. As it happens, Jedi Knight was a Windows exclusive game, unlike the original Dark Forces, which was also released for Macintosh and PlayStation. For the PlayStation fanatics though, Jedi Knight also offered a third-person view in addition to the primary first-person view, which actually comes handy occasionally in the game. The immersion into the Star Wars world in Jedi Knight has been turned up to 11, with you now getting the chance to use a lightsaber and gain force skills to deal with situations you couldn't handle in any regular first-person shooter. Also, there are familiar areas taken from the movies to walk in, and you can even hear a bit of one of the Jizz tunes that was played in a Mos Eisley cantina on planet Tatooine. Yes, it is actually called Jizz. Despite the excellent writing and immersion, I have never actually completed Jedi Knight because I got stuck at some point and didn't bother to check any walkthroughs to make further progress, but it certainly left an everlasting impression on an 18-year-old me. Oddly enough, Jedi Knight is still my favorite Star Wars experience since then. This game is also available on at least GOG.com, if not elsewhere. Interstate 76. Like Jedi Knight, this one is a PC exclusive, and I'm sorry to say the GOG version doesn't perform perfectly. For perfection, you would need a machine as suggested by the original box, as well as the original CD-ROM to get it to play flawlessly. But the biggest reason to get a hold of the original boxed CD-ROM version is the funkiest original soundtrack in the history of computer and video games, written by Arian Salazar, who became the founding member of Third Eye Blind. Now let's take a good listen to the theme tune before we continue. As suggested by the title, this is a game that takes place largely on roads. More precisely, this is a vehicular combat simulator in which the entirety of the action in the game takes place inside a car. The year 76 in the title is a direct reference to the game's style, which is taken straight from the 70s cop shows and blaxploitation films. Due to the focus on the actual combat and damage modeling, Interstate 76 isn't a racing driver's game, and even at the time of release, this wasn't a particularly pretty game to look at, even on more powerful 3D graphics cards. For the most part, the idea is to get the job done, which it does very nicely where the gameplay is concerned. However, an analog joystick is highly recommended for precision. Unlike the sequel, Interstate 82, and the Vigilante 8 spin-offs, I-76 is decidedly more of a simulation, yet all the cinematics and odd racing bits make it more enjoyable than your average simulation. If you have never tried it before, do yourself a favor and give it a chance. There's more to my blabber here than just nostalgia, although it's definitely high on this one.
Oh shit.
Our next game is actually more of a franchise than a single game. Skaermtrolden Hugo. Don't know if I pronounced it right, but Hugo it is. The reason for including it here is because Hugo had an interactive TV gaming show here in Finland, as I'm sure it had all throughout the rest of Scandinavia. I used to watch the show a lot as a kid, thinking, how hard can it be to just follow the instructions on the TV screen by pushing keys on the numpad of your telephone, before realizing there's bound to be some sort of a delay to all the player's actions. The attraction of Hugo in the TV show had more to do with the host of the show and the Finnish overdubs for the troll than the actual gameplay, which felt overly simplistic, but it was prettier than anything I'd ever seen on the 16-bits or PC so far. As it happens, Hugo actually was run from a PC, and a huge amount of Hugo games were later released for not only PC but PlayStation, Amiga, and one got even made for the old Commodore 64, which was completely unnecessary, but an interesting attempt nonetheless. I managed to obtain one CD-ROM of Hugo's first games dubbed in Finnish a while ago, footage of which you're seeing right now. Although it runs on modern PCs, the colors are all messed up, so you need an old PC to run the game perfectly. Long story short, the nostalgia for Hugo has nothing to do with having ever played it, but rather seeing it being played on TV. And, admittedly, it works better as a memory than experience. But it's a game I nostalgicize about. And then something very different. Myst from Cyan. Originally released for the Macintosh in 1993, Myst has since been released for almost any possible platform with either a CD-ROM drive or enough storage space in any form to be able to run it. I've only played it on a Windows PC, and the first time I played it was on a Windows 3.11, probably around 1996 or 97. The original Myst took the form of a point-and-click adventure game in first-person view, but it's more of an abstract puzzle than anything, and feels like a predecessor to modern escape room games. There have been several remakes of Myst for PC, of which the two versions of Real Myst feature free movement and real-time 3D graphics instead of pre-rendered stills. Seeing as Myst was at one point the biggest selling PC game of all time with more than 6 million copies sold, it shouldn't be too obscure to any retro gamer, but as a quick description of the game's proceedings, let's just say that you solve odd puzzles that are interconnected to different realms. You have to travel through a book, the pages of which have been scattered around the game. There is also a fairly lengthy plotline to digest as well, which you actually need to do in order to get any real sense into anything you're supposed to do in the game. At the time, Myst offered an unparalleled experience in puzzle solving in unique environments and atmospheres, but the game spawned not only a huge number of sequels and spin-offs, but also unconnected clones, tributes, and even parodies. If you had so far been in the dark about Myst, all the games in the series are available on Steam and elsewhere. It's definitely worth checking out, if only to see what the big fuss was all about in the mid-90s, but there's always the danger of getting addicted to it. This time I'd like to end this episode by mentioning a bunch of mini-games for Windows systems up to Windows 95 and 98, which I used to play quite a lot, even though they were mostly there for the lack of a better term, coffee break fun. Of course, since my personal introduction to Windows was 3.1, I don't really know whether or not any of these games were around prior to that, but I'm assuming at least some of them were. But let's start with the one most of you probably know the best, Space Cadet Pinball. Originally this table was a part of Maxis' Full Tilt Pinball, but a slightly modified version of it, the one most of us likely know the best, was first bundled with Microsoft Plus 95 package, but the last version of Windows it was officially part of was Windows XP. You can still play this on the current Windows if you can bother to download it from a third-party site. Jazzball is a neat little arcade puzzler by Dima Pavlovsky, published originally in the fourth Microsoft Entertainment Pack in 1992. Similarly to Quicks, the idea is to reduce the open area to a certain amount in order to move on to the next level. The game is played by dividing spaces with your mouse cursor, and any area that has a ball bouncing within remains open. It's still very addicting. Ski Free, written by Chris Perry, was also originally published in a Microsoft Entertainment Pack. This one was featured in pack number 3. Inspired by skiing for the Atari 2600, Ski Free has a rather straightforward approach to the sport, but the graphics reveal a surprisingly humoristic approach to it. Now here's a shareware game I used to play a lot, Slam by Robert Epps. It's an air hockey game well worth checking out for its simplicity and mouse control. It was a fully working game in its shareware form, so I don't know if anyone ever actually registered it. Oh well. And another shareware game I used to play a lot was Winroids by Stephen Baxter, which was, according to the game's README files, his first proper Windows application he ever made. A nice one for a first, I have to say. Obviously, it's an Asteroids clone, but it uses ray tracing for its 3D-ish graphics, and there are a few funny sampled sound effects and a nice mid-song for a soundtrack, which I rarely actually listen to while playing. One more shareware thing that I came back to occasionally through at least 10-year period was Kyodai Mahjong. To me, this kind of mahjong was the equivalent of solitaire and other solo card games, and I used to spend hours on Kyodai Mahjong. Also, it was always nice to see new versions of the game come out every other year or so. The last thing I mention for now is a variant of an already little-known independent hobbyist game, Kalles Monopol, which was modified to feature a board based on old software companies and the mother of all abandonware websites at the time, home of the underdogs. Naturally, this variant was called Hotupoly. I used to play this a lot with one of my friends while listening to the Red Beatles compilation 1962-66, solidifying my eternal obsession to old games and the Beatles. I'm sure there are more of these Windows minigames out there which could be worth pointing out in one of these episodes, but these were my primary obsessions of this particular sort, and some of them still are worth having a go whenever possible.